chance to sort of introduce ourselves a little bit, but I'll just introduce Ariel Rokem again. Ariel is a data scientist at the University of Washington, and he's going to talk to us today about reproducibility. So want to take it away, Ariel?
Okay, thanks. So it's great to be with you virtually, and I'll start my slides in just a minute. So the way I was hoping to structure this is that I'll tell you a little bit first about where I am, what I do, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the research that I'm doing and the kind of projects that I work with. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I'll call the elements of reproducible open science. I'll focus on a few points that I think are sort of interesting. And then I have a bunch of slides, but maybe we'll sort of have a little bit of a conversation, as I understand, and a little bit of discussion around these things. And we'll see how that goes. OK, so let me switch over. Here we go. So first of all, just to tell you, the slides are actually, as you can see up here, it's a website, so you can follow along the slides, and some of them have links that go to other places. So you can take those as notes afterwards and then kind of see what are the different things that I'm talking about. I made an Etherpad over here. If you want to click on that and go to this Etherpad, you can take notes in here collaboratively. So if you go to that link and you type in, then you might be able to see each other's notes and take notes together. We find that that's a useful way of taking notes in this kind of situation. Anyway, as Christy mentioned, I'm a data scientist, and I'm part of what's called the University of Washington eScience Institute. This is an institute that's been here at the University of Washington for a few years now. And for the last couple of years, we've been funded by the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Washington Research Foundation, to create an environment in the university for data science. And part of that effort has been the hiring of people like me who do data science, but within the academic environment. That means our focus is very much on creating software for science, on collaborating with scientists in driving data-intensive research in a variety of different fields. So that means I collaborate with people in a variety of different fields on a variety of different kinds of projects. And much of our focus is on creating the kind of environment that will promote reproducible and open science in the university. Despite some fairly strong incentives against that, we're trying to counter that by creating incentives for people and the kinds of tools that people need in order to do research that is reproducible and open. And so part of that is thinking a lot about what does it mean to be reproducible and open. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to talk about what I think of the main elements, what I think of as the main elements of reproducible and open research. So I'll talk sort of about three broad topics. The first is automation and what we'll call computational reproducibility. I'll unpack that in a few minutes. The second is the availability of the data and the code that make up a research project that includes data and code. And then finally, the sort of the final point that I'll talk less about today, and I think you've heard about before, is open access to publication and open access to the products of the research. Let me take a little detour through human neuroscience, though, just to give you a bit of the context in which I myself work. So my own research is in human neuroscience. It's a pretty old field. So it started with one of the starting points of human neuroscience is these neurologists that worked in the 19th century. And their data was the brains of people who had died of various causes. And before these people died, they may have had some kind of a deficit in behavior. For example, they might have had what's called here conduction aphasia, is some problem with speech. And visual agnosia refers to a problem with recognizing visual objects. Apraxia is some difficulty in moving, and then alexia is also something to do with speech and with reading. And so these neurologists noticed that the normal behavior or lack thereof was dependent on the presence of connections between different parts of the human brain. I should say, for all you entomologists, these pictures here, these gray blobs here, are pictures of the human brain. So just so you know, okay. So, you know, we've known this now for about 150 years. We've had this idea that human behavior is supported by brain connectivity. And the question is, how do we measure this? This is a human brain again. Now we're looking from the bottom, and the parts of this brain have been now, in post-mortem dissection, have been scraped away. And what you can see is that these connections between different parts of the brain are these big tubes that sweep from one part of the brain to the other. They sweep, and they're pretty big, actually, right? So this is several centimeters of what we call the white matter. The white matter is the part of the brain that contains connections between different parts of the brain. And those connections are made out of nerve fibers. And those nerve fibers bundle into these large bundles that we call fascicles sometimes. And the question is, how do we measure this now in a living human being? We want to be able to make these measurements and connect them to normal human behavior. And that's important because we know that these are not just passive cables. These brain connections change with development, and individual differences between people account for differences in behavior. And they might even change with learning along the lifetime. So we might want to measure these white matter connections in a single individual over the course of their lifetime. And this provides us potentially with clinically useful information about that individual, these differences between different individuals and changes over time in a single individual. And the answer to the question, how do you do that, is magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. MRI is an instrument that allows us to measure many different aspects of the physical structure of our body and our brain. We can measure neural activity. There's something called functional MRI. You might have seen images of sort of colorful blobs on top of brains telling us which parts of the brain receive blood. And that's an indication to us that there's some function that operates through those parts of the brains. Another kind of MRI will give us fairly detailed structural information or anatomy. And that can be done at millimeter resolution in a living human brain. And then there are many different kinds, but the kind that I work with most is called diffusion MRI, and it focuses on brain connectivity, on measurements of the white matter. And so these are those white matter bundles, and if we zoom in a microscope, we see that they're made out of many, many individual cells, and they're what are called axons, are these fibers that make up the cell body's long-range connections to other parts of the brain. And in all of that, there's water. And diffusion MRI relies on the following principle. If the water is held within some part of the brain that's circular, roughly spherical, then it will diffuse in all directions in the same manner. And we call that isotropic diffusion. But if we're looking at a cable, one of these cables, then water diffusion is more, there's more water diffusion along the length of the cable than across the boundaries of the cable. And we call that anisotropic diffusion. And we can measure that with the MRI in these cables. So here it is in the cables themselves, using this method called diffusion MRI. So here are diffusion MRI images. The idea is that the image becomes darker and brighter as a function of the direction of a magnetic field gradient. So we measure many, many times the brain, many, many times, about 150 times in this case, with magnetic field gradients in different directions. And the signal becomes, the MRI signal becomes darker and lighter as a function of the direction. So you can see that this is a slice, a horizontal slice through the brain. And in this horizontal slice, different parts become brighter and darker as the gradients rotate around. Now we can take that information and we can sort of model the directions of diffusion in every single individual part of the brain. Here I'm again looking at a horizontal slice through the center of the brain. This is an MRI of an individual person. And if we zoom in, we can see that if we modeled it in every single place, it kind of it kind of points us in the direction of the diffusion of water in all these locations. And we can model, using that, we can model the tracks, the connectivity between different parts of the brain, and we can create that in many different locations. Here's a movie of this same brain. Now you can see that those red strands, these red spaghettis, are sort of a model of what we think the white matter connections are between different parts of the front of the brain of this one individual. And doing that many, many times, we can assess both the connectivity, but also the properties of the physical properties of different connections. And we can make many different kinds of inferences about differences between individuals and the health and conditions of the brains of this individual, another individual, etc. So let me just pause here. That was sort of just an introduction to the kind of science that I do, just to motivate things that I'll show you in what will follow. What questions do people have at this point about this?
This is just very cool. I've never seen images like this, and I can only imagine what your data must look like. All this three-dimensional mapping, and wow.
Yeah, so the data are fairly large. They're not, I work together with astrophysicists here at the eScience Institute. It's not really the size that astronomical images are, and astronomical images appropriately have astronomical size for some reason. It's not really the size of individual human genomes, which are also very, very big, but it's, it's a few 100,000, a few million measurements per direction, and then many different directions. We get a few 100 million measurements in each one of these data sets. So the data size is very large.
Oh, yeah.
That challenges reproducibility, because now we need to deal with this. And then as you saw in what I presented, the analysis has several different steps. We do the estimation of the diffusion in individual locations, and then we do tracking, and there are many other kinds of steps that take place. And each one of them, there's sort of software that takes care with each one of these parts, and that makes also reproducibility of these results rather challenging.
Right. Yeah, in ecology, we don't tend to have data sets even close to that. I'm doing what they consider sort of big data ecology, and I think my largest data set has 3.2 million lines. Mm. So we like to say that we do big-ish data.
And I think, it's like there's a very it's actually about neurons. There's a paper, if I remember correctly, the paper title was "One Too Many," right? Mm-hmm. So the numbers 1, 2, and then many. So it's like once you go beyond having 2 neurons, you just have a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And the same applies here. I think once you go beyond the data that you can easily load into a spreadsheet and look at in one glance, it just becomes, there are certain principles that apply regardless of the size of the data in order for things to be really reproducible. And maybe even applies to small data when you have only a few dozen numbers.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as I watch that thing spin, what's the background of that particular image?
The background, you mean
the project you did, or
yeah, so this is the brain of what we did. This is data that I collected when I was a postdoc at Stanford in Brian Wendell's lab there. And when we were working there, me and my colleagues there, several other postdocs and graduate students, we were working a lot on developing methods for doing these measurements and modeling these data. And so we collected a lot of data on each other. And so this brain actually belongs to one of my colleagues from that time. And the background really is this work on development of methods. We measured in individual brains many different conditions, many different spatial resolutions, many different gradient. You can apply different gradient strengths, and we were working a lot on methods to model this. And then sort of the kind of scientific findings that led to are actually relate to parts of the brain that are in the back of the brain and have to do with vision. we were very interested in the connections between different parts of the brain that analyze visual information. So as information comes in through our eyes, it goes to particular parts of the brain that contain maps of the visual field. And there are connections between them. And we were studying these connections and how they transmit information between different parts of the visual cortex that presumably do different things, different kinds of information processing operations on the visual information. And so part of what makes this intriguing is you get all these different parts of the brain. How do they talk to each other? And the answer is they talk to each other through these cables. And so we were able to sort of measure and delineate the location of those connections between these maps. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I was just curious where it came from.
So that's sort of the background. Okay, and so you do this kind of stuff, and one of the things you realize pretty soon is that you're dealing a lot with data and with software. And we were very inspired by this cool quote from actually also researchers at Stanford, where I was before I came here. And they're statisticians, and they did a lot of work over the years on analysis of various kinds of signals, a lot of signal processing. And they noticed that for them, an article about a computational result, so you can think of a computational result being a result that comes out of any kind of computation, really. An article about a computational result is advertising, not scholarship. And for them, the actual scholarship is the full software environment, code and data that produce the result. And they were very early in on this. I mean, this is a quote from 1995. This is more than 20 years ago that they realized that. And that realization is slowly making its way also into many other fields as well. I think that many fields are experiencing now both a growth in the size of the data, and so computational, it used to be that computational results used to be sort of a niche thing, right? Only a few kinds of sciences really needed computers in order to derive the results, but increasingly we all need computers because the data sets become so large and the kinds of transformations that we're trying to do are so complicated that we all need computers these days in order to do any kind of analysis. And so this is becoming more and more relevant to an increasingly larger number of different kinds of scientific fields. And different fields are noticing this in different ways. There was I actually studied psychology as an undergrad, and I got a graduate degree in psychology and then in neuroscience. And in psychology, there was a recent realization through a very big project that aimed to reproduce. I think they tried to reproduce studies, and they failed to reproduce many of them. The selection was not done based on any prejudice. They took studies that appeared in journals, fairly mainstream journals, and did what seems to be an honest attempt to reproduce these results, and failed in many, many cases. And so many fields are now realizing that reproducibility is something that we need to think about. How do we do science that is not only one paper advertising the result and then move on? And so this course obviously is part of this thinking. One point that I thought I'd make before I talk about different ways to make your science more reproducible is that reproducible and open science are a matter of degree, not of kind. And I think that's important because I think once I'll start talking about things, you might feel a little bit overwhelmed. It'll be like, oh, do this and do the other thing and all these instructions about things that you're supposed to do. And I'll make up front just the argument that every step that you take along the way to become more reproducible makes your science more reproducible and open. And you want to make it more reproducible because science per definition should be reproducible. But because it's challenging, you might want to do that step by step. Choose the steps that you can do easily first, and then increasingly do more and more things that make your science more and more reproducible. So I think it's important to make that distinction just so that you don't feel that either it's reproducible and then you have to do all these, and now you have all these things that you need to do, or it's not reproducible at all. I don't believe that's the case. I think it's a matter of degree rather than a matter of. So let me come back to how do we make that vision that Buckhead and Donahoe set out in that quote, how do we make that actually possible. And I'll focus on 3 different things. The first is automation and what we'll call computational reproducibility. Then I'll talk a little bit about the availability of data and code. And finally, I'll just touch on open access to publication. There's one point I might make there, but we'll see how we get along. And so from now on, I'll also invite you to maybe interrupt me as I go along if you have questions. Let's see. Are there any questions? Well, what questions do you have about what I've talked about so far?
No.
If no questions, then I'll go into automation. So, okay, in order to make things reproducible, one kind of test that you can ask yourself is whether you can produce all the figures in your paper. Now we're talking about, let's say that you're writing a paper that you aim to publish. It contains some set of results, and those results are encoded in figures. They're encoded maybe in statements inside the paper about numbers. We found that this was the average measurement of something or another with these error bars. Can you actually produce all these numbers, all these figures in your paper with a single button press? If you've automated everything, that should be the case. You should be able to press a single button and get everything to just appear on your screen as it was in the paper. As I said, there are degrees of this, right? You might automate every figure separately. And so I've done that. I can show you. Let me, I'll switch over to a project related to those diffusion MRI data. Let's see. I'll stop sharing. I'll go over. I'll share another screen. This is a bit tricky. Here we go. So now I'm sharing with you repository on GitHub. Have you seen GitHub before?
Oh yeah.
Yes. So this is the repository that was the project that became eventually a paper, and so this contains lots of code. I wrote lots of code in Python and to fit various models and compare them to each other. The details themselves are not too important. What I will point out is that in the documentation, I have a folder called Paper Figures, and in here I have a Jupyter notebook that contains the code needed in order to generate one of the figures. So this generates, here you can see figures of the signal and some location in the brain, and this is all the code that is needed in order to generate the different elements of that figure. And there's one of these notebooks for every one of the figures. And so this is, this is the kind of automation. Now I can hand over, somebody else can come to GitHub and download this entire repository, and provided that they've also downloaded the data, which I've made available, I'll talk about that in just a second, they can install this software, they can run these notebooks, and they should get the same figures that I got as well. So this addresses this issue of advertising versus, to some degree at least, it addresses the issue of advertising versus providing the computational environment. Get back to my presentation.
Yeah, and it's our hope. We're working on a data set in this class, and we're hoping fully scripted analysis and all the figures generated all together. We're working out of R. We're using RStudio to interface with GitHub in this class.
Okay, so I'll sort of adjust what I'm talking about to R. I was going to recommend Jupyter. Jupyter is great in Python, but it also supports, I think, about 40 other programming languages. So those notebooks that I showed you, they're written in this format called Jupyter. It's this notebook format. So I sit there, and actually the code I'm writing, the code in my browser inside a code cell, and those get rendered into these cells. Here's another example. This is work that I'm working on right now. So I'm collaborating with a professor here at University of Washington, Jason Yateman. His expertise is in what's called automated fiber quantification. The idea is you you go in and you can kind of quantify the properties of the brain tissue along the length of nerve fibers. And here is the GitHub repository that we're working on. This is, again, a Jupyter notebook, and that contains all the steps of the, so, as we're working, we're typing code into these cells on our own machines, and that runs the code. In this case, it's Python. You're used to looking at R, but it looks quite the same when you do this with R. And it's actually the case that R has other tools to do this. There's a format called R Markdown that is also a literate programming method, and that allows you to write your paper together with your code in one document. And then every time you run it, every time you make changes to your code, you run it, and the figures get rendered anew in this format. So I don't know if you've seen R Markdown, that format. It's worth checking out. And as I said, this is all called, the title this all goes under is literate programming. The idea is that you're people used to think of software as something that you write for machines to read. But the truth is that more often, software, or not more often, but very, very often, software is something that other people will need to read as well. And so having your code explain itself is something that's really valuable. I think just providing the code by itself is good and might allow people to reproduce your results. But if they want to extend your results, and that's a major goal of reproducibility, is that we'll, instead of each one of us working in our own separate corners, that other be able to extend our results. If you want your code to be not only reproducible but also useful, then thinking about another person reading that code is key to reproducibility and extensibility of the work. And the first person, maybe you don't want to be so altruistic, maybe you don't want to think about other people, but consider yourself 6 months from now, and consider what it will feel like to look at code that you're writing right now. If you don't write it in a way that's literate, in a way that explains itself, you're the first person who will have trouble reading this code. So you might think of writing code together with other people in your team, and collaborating with other people that are not on your team, and maybe some collaborator in a broader sense reading your code. But your first collaborator that you might think about is yourself 6 months from now. So using literate programming methods is a way to automate what you do and allows you to reproduce what you do. Any questions about automation, about literate programming? Comments?
The automating, like, it, you don't necessarily want it for the automation in and of itself, right? It's just kind of a test of whether you wrote a code that that does everything, that I don't know, that spells out everything that you did. You weren't like, is it like kind of an honesty test? I'm sort of wondering that.
It is, but it is also a matter of provenance tracking. Yeah. So have you heard the term provenance tracking before?
I don't think so.
So provenance, the word itself just means what is the origin of something. Mm-hmm. And in the context of scientific work, provenance tracking means that if you are looking at a figure that contains some data points showing some result, you want to know how those numbers got there.
Right.
And that means that you want to know what are all the transformations that happen from the raw data to the point at which you're looking at this figure. And as I mentioned before, and it's probably true in many fields of science, you probably do many steps of transformation. And true provenance tracking requires automation in the sense that there's no step that is, there's sort of a chain of custody of the evidence, right? You can think of it as a chain of custody from the raw data to the result, to the conclusion.
Yeah,
go ahead.
There's no way you could draw in a point or draw on your own error bar or something like that.
Unless you code.
Exactly.
Right, and
that's pretty obvious.
Yeah, so the automation is a standard for tracking everything you do.
And one point at which this chain of custody or the provenance tracking breaks down is when you're doing manual transformations on the data. So we often find ourselves in a situation where, for example, in neuroimaging, something that does happen quite a bit is that you sit there and you're trying to delineate inside a brain the location of some structure. And because this is very hard to automate, because these images are just shades of gray, really, the human eye is much better at detecting boundaries between parts of the image. And often we'll have to go and sit and draw by hand. We'll have to draw by hand the regions that we're interested in and demarcate those boundaries. And that's a point that's a point at which the provenance tracking is broken. We can't repeat that exactly as we did before because it depends on on the level of arousal of the person doing this and their mood and their internal criteria of what we consider part of this structure and what we don't consider part of the structure. This is something that is very hard to document. It's also just, besides being irreproducible, it's just not repeatable also, because if you let somebody do it on 2 different days, they might do something that's slightly different. It's unavoidable for some kinds of research projects, but in order to be more reproducible, we want to avoid those steps. If there are steps that we can automate that we do by hand, we want to automate those. Now, I'll start a new parenthesis here that for me, a major reason to automate things that I do is laziness. I know from my experience as a researcher that everything that I do once, I'll need to do more than once.
Yeah.
And from my experience early on in grad school, I learned that whatever I do once, my advisor will probably ask me to do again in a slightly different way. And so it was just a defensive maneuver to write scripts that are easy to change and laziness, really. But that laziness is good in the sense, in the reproducibility sense, because it promotes reproducibility. It allows other, and laziness on my part is actually saving time for the entire community of researchers working in my field. That accelerates. You could argue that accelerates the progress of research in my field. Yeah, more questions about automation?
I just remember my first fully automated figure and how empowering it felt, because inevitably one of the co-authors says, "Oh, could you change this?" And then I could say yes, and I change a line of code and then rerun it, and then it's the same thing, but with instead of blue, it'll be green, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's also good science, just good science in a very basic sense, to be able to change things that you're doing when as new information comes in, being able to easily change what you're doing. If new information, a new paper that you read about something that you need to change in your analysis requires 3 weeks of work from you, that's a really high barrier to jump, and you'll tend to just not incorporate that information in. If it's impossible, if it's entirely impossible to redo the analysis because it requires so many manual steps and you don't even remember what those manual steps were, then it's not reproducible in your hands, and certainly it won't be reproducible in any other person's hands, even if you make your data available.
Mm-hmm. And cases where you have done an analysis and then have new data come in, or you do your analysis and you find that there's some outlier or something weird happening with the data point, and you go back to your notebook and you go, "Oh, well, there's a reason that I should drop this data point." Being able to automate it and just rerun the analysis completely with the outlier out in minutes, that is really vindicating.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments?
Oh, so yeah, I have a question. So talking about the automating, do you think using something like latex to write a paper is another way of automating? Because it's like most of the time people write with Microsoft Word, and sometimes when you need to change the chapters number, you need to change a figure, you have to start from the very beginning and change everything to +1 or -1. And yeah, to me, it's like if we have a latex which has the automated and preset structure, we only need to insert everything or just did a little bit using a line of code to change whatever figures or text we want to put in.
Yeah, LaTeX, I agree with you. It has a similar feeling in manuscript production. It was, it was produced by computer scientists that had this line of thinking in their head already, that you'll automate whatever you can. And also from my experience of writing manuscripts is that you'll rewrite everything that you write many, many times. And so if you put in upfront this automation, it reduces the barriers. Yeah, all these things, to be realistic, all these things have a cost. You need to now learn how to use a system that is slightly more complicated than just opening, a Google Doc and starting to type. I find that for me, in writing collaboratively with others, I want to track the provenance of the sentences also. I want to know, when did I change this? Why did I change it? So I tend to like systems that allow me to track the document as we go along. I don't know if you've talked about version control in this course before. Yeah, so version control, I try to version control stuff that I write as well as the code that I write. So it's originally designed to track. Version control systems that we use nowadays, Git and others, are designed to track software, lines of software. They're not designed to track necessarily documents, and they have some quirks when it comes to tracking documents. But to me, it's better than, for example, systems that sync up like Google Docs, where you log into your document and now it's changed from last time that you looked at it. And Google Docs actually does well by allowing you to look at the full history of changes. So it's not that bad. But it doesn't allow the level of automation that LaTeX gives you.
Yeah, version control is a pain if everybody in your lab is using just Word. Because sometimes 2 or 3 people, they might working on a separate copy of something, and when you want to combine or merge the changes, you have to do it like yourself.
Yeah. Whole thing there.
Yeah, so merging is a big argument for a version control system that automatically computes what it needs to do in order to merge 2 different versions of a document. Where it's very hard. I know often the trick is often it falls as an onus on the person who's sort of wrangling the document, usually the first author, to collect versions from different collaborators and then merge them together. I spent way too many hours doing that. Say that again, Christy.
That's usually the postdoc in the lab.
or the graduate student writing that. And so there's, of course, depending on who you collaborate with, you may or may not be able to convince them that they should learn how to automate their workflow together with you. That's life. Okay, so I'll just say a little bit more about also public availability of data and code, which is sort of the next element. So automate everything you can, and then try to make everything that you do something that others can easily access, right? Easily access. I put sharing is caring down there. I talked about that before with others. Some people think of sharing as something altruistic that they're doing. Sharing the data, sharing the code is sort of a service that you do to your community in some sense. But what if you don't care? Or you don't want to be altruistic at all? And one other way to think about it is calling it publishing. Instead, publishing is good, right? We all want to publish papers. We all want to publish products of our research. I'll argue that we increasingly want to publish other kinds of products, not only the papers that end up being sort of stories about the science we did, but we want to publish other artifacts of our research as well. Code, data are two of sort of the major parts of that. So reasons that data and code sharing or publication rather are important. This is based on another researcher in my field, J.B. Paulini, wrote a paper about this, and he discussed a few points about why this is important for the field. First of all, it accelerates progress. I talked about that before. If you can extend something that somebody else did, if I don't have to go and recollect data that somebody else has already collected, that accelerates progress in our field. Many fields have demonstrated the benefits of that. Astronomy and genomics that I mentioned before are really actually pioneering in that sense. These fields have major shared community resources of data mostly. The Human Genome Project is a shared resource that was developed by a very large community of researchers. Astronomy has other kinds of sort of sky surveys, publicly available sky surveys. You can download these data and analyze them. And that improves the quality of the publications. And it improves the quality of the data as well. If you have to quality control your data for publication, then you'll make sure twice that your data really is as good as you claim that it is in your paper. So it improves the quality of the science. And then it reduces the cost of the research. It increases the return on investment. If one person collected a set of data once, reusing that data just saves time and saves cost. And then finally, the point of reproducibility that I've made before. And for all these reasons, at least in my field, funding agencies, journals are increasingly requiring that you do that. There are many journals that now require that data be available as part of the publication of a paper. And for all those reasons, you're going to have to learn how to do it, whether or not you feel altruistic about it. Actually, sharing has some other more selfish benefits. There's a data sharing advantage. All else being equal, there's about a 10% more increase in citations of a paper when the data is shared. And I think it's clear why that's the case. It's because that data is available. That data gets reused by others who then cite the original publication with which that data first appeared. And making the data available, the work available, allows others to build on your work. And that produces these kind of selfish benefits that work then has more impact. So it makes the research better, and therefore it has more impact when the data is available. It's just, another metric for saying that the research is better in some sense. And there's similar effects when software is shared. Research gets cited more when the code is available that produced the research. And there's this halo effect that happens. For the time being, people somehow still think that you're being altruistic. So they look at you, if you're doing things in an open and reproducible manner, they'll look at you and say, oh, you're being really altruistic, and you're doing more than you're required somehow. I don't know what that means usually, but I don't know. There's this weird halo effect that still happens somehow. So enjoy it while it lasts. So another point about availability is open source everything. So to the degree that you can do your research using open source tools like R, like Python, like LaTeX, like everything. To the degree that you can use open source tools, it'll make it easier for others to use to build on your research. If you're using some kind of complicated proprietary software to do your research, even if you've written code that runs on this proprietary software and you've made it available, there's some people for whom the availability of that proprietary software is going to be a hinder. And so use open source everything as much as you can. I'll mention maybe this kind of ecosystem effect that happens when you start using open source tools. One example of that is a community that I'm involved in. It's a Python community, and you're using R, so I'll just talk about it briefly. But there are similar effects that happen in the R world that I know of. there's sort of this ecosystem that the language itself is open source, and people have built open source tools to do basic computing on top of the language, NumPy and SciPy. And then people build these kind of other tools that are general computing tools, like libraries for machine learning. There's one, scikit-learn, that's very, very useful for image processing. In my field, image processing is really, really important. So scikit-image becomes a really important tool. It's not for a particular scientific domain. It's one that many scientific domains use. And then at the end of this kind of ecosystem, or solar system, there are very specific tools that work in certain domains. So you'll see at the top here, there's something called NiPy. That's neuroimaging in Python. It's a community of people that build open source software based on all these tools for neuroimaging. So we build our own domain-specific tools. I'm particularly involved in a project called DiPy. That's diffusion imaging in Python. So there's this big network of people working together on open source tools, and the ripple effects, the quality that goes into the work on the basic tools, that translates into the quality of these end users, people in different scientific domains. So if you want your stuff to be reproducible, one way is to improve the quality and make it more reproducible, is to make everything open source and to contribute to tools that are used by a broader community. I benefit from the fact that I make my code open source through a larger project. I benefit from the fact that others are using this, and those other people contribute back to this this community with bug fixes. So somebody else is fixing the bugs in my code for me, just due to the fact that I make this code widely available and useful to others. I get the benefits of the work of others that are using this. Any questions, comments about open source everything?
So far, so good.
Yeah. I think these guys are good.
Okay, everybody's nodding. I don't see you, but you're probably all nodding there. Okay, so I'll go ahead. Let's talk a little bit about considerations in publishing data in particular. I assume that you're all, or some of you are collecting data, or are some of you collecting data of your own?
We will.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will.
Okay. So here's something that's good that you're not there yet, because some of the considerations in making data available to others are considerations that you can do before you start collecting the data. Ultimately, you'll want to make sure that your data has a permanent URL. Figshare is one website that allows you to deposit files that others can then download from there. Your library might actually have services that let you share your data through data repositories. I took a look a little bit at your library and found a few resources. Those are linked there in blue in my presentation, things that might be useful to you at your university. Provide code that makes your data useful, or usable even. And then for you that are sort of getting started, start thinking about the data and code sharing at the very start of the project. Don't do all the project and then scramble to think, okay, now I need to share this. What do I need to do in order to share? If you're collecting data on humans, as I am, you need to get IRB approval, and you need to make include data sharing in them. For you, that might be less relevant. One thing to think about at this point at which you are is about collaborations with others. Make sure that those people know that you intend to share the data in the end, and that they're okay with that. They might have their own considerations. Have that conversation up front instead. So sort of like the conversations that you probably have with your collaborators about who does what part of the work and who gets what credit on the work. Consider having a conversation about how are we going to share the products of our research at the end.
Okay.
I have a little concern and question for you. So you said that we have to, or whoever who's doing the research has to start sharing the data from the beginning when they start collecting the data.
No, I'll correct that. Start thinking about sharing the data.
Okay,
when you start the project. You don't have to put everything publicly up immediately when you start collecting that.
Yes.
But at some point, you will want to make that public.
Yes, but if you have, you're right. I mean, you can start thinking to sharing data if you have collaborators, from different places, if it's not in your university. And I always have the thought that you can share your data after you publish it first time and make it available public.
That seems about right to me. The point at which you're publishing a paper about your data is probably a good point to share your data. And some journals will require that. I think it's an individual choice. You need to make the list of pros and cons. I've made a lot of lists. I've made a lot of arguments pro, and the arguments con are probably the kinds of arguments that your collaborators will bring up. What if the competition steals our data and scoops us? I'm looking for evidence that that kind of thing actually happens. Does anyone have a story, a horror story, where that has happened?
Not really.
No, nothing like where you actually take data and publish on it.
It's mostly fighting for authorship, but it's
Yeah.
not for scooping.
Mhm. Or
Yeah, that's with your collaborators, not with your competitors.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there may be a case where a lab is working on a very similar problem and publishes it before you. But is that scooping, or did they just do the experiment faster than you? I don't know.
Yeah, I
Like,
hear people worrying more about their ideas getting stolen than their actual data getting
Yeah,
stolen.
that's
I
So make your data and code available, and your competitors will get cited less than you, right?
yeah, 10%.
That's the really Machiavellian way of saying it. But I think it's actually true. I mean, if if you and some competing group are doing something really similar, and one group produces data and code to back that up, I would say that evidence, especially if you're disagreeing about somebody, if I had to choose who to believe, I would believe the people who give me coded data to reproduce the results, not the people who say, "Oh, trust me, I'm a scientist."
Mhm.
But start thinking about the fact that you will want to share start having that conversation. When do we share our data and our code with your collaborators at the outset of the project? And in order to make it easy in the end, think of arranging your data in files in the way that you will ultimately share it, right? If there's some private information in those data that can't be shared, you need to be sure to de-anonymize the data in some way. Or if you're only willing to share parts of the data, you need to subsection out the data and save it separately in some way. And that'll make not only the sharing easier, I think it'll make the work on the project easier, actually. If it's arranged in a certain way that makes sense from the start, then you're writing the software for this arrangement of the data, and all the automation parts become easier as well. So I think it makes good sense from that point of view as well. If you are creating a unique data set, you can consider publishing a data paper. There are several journals out there nowadays that allow you to publish data sets. The description of the data set, what's in there, why it's useful, and if you want it to be really useful, here's some code that takes and loads the data into memory and arranges it in a way that some other person can build upon that. It's another line in your CV and another way for people to cite you and cite your work. And it increases the return on investment just in the field. It improves the research field in which you are. So that's a great way, I think, for people to get credit for making data public in a sort of traditional way. Okay, do you have what more questions do you have about?
Is this open source data paper?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, typically they would be published in an open access journal, though not necessarily. Some of them, the Ecological Society does data papers now. I've reviewed a couple for them.
I've never seen one.
Yeah, really cool things. So
yeah, there's a journal called Scientific Data.
Yeah.
Let me try to find it.
That's interesting.
Mhm. And so it gives you something a little bit more than just a data
Here it is.
entry to cite.
It's a Nature Publishing Group art journal, and so some of it is open access. It's probably got an open access option, but I don't think it's open access per definition. Right, and you can see they publish all kinds of stuff. Biodiversity is maybe relevant to some of you. So this is dataset biodiversity, dataset, etc. So that's kind of a cool way to go about it, and one that makes it makes I think it eases also collaborations between data collectors and data analyzers, because it allows both sides to enjoy the fruits of the work. Collecting data is a lot of work, and people want to capitalize on that. This is another way to capitalize on it, while at the same time making the research reproducible. So it doesn't have to be just an altruistic thing. I mean, I'll be honest, I think we're all researchers for at least a little bit altruistic reasons. This is just a way to make that altruism more effective. Any more questions, comments about data sharing?
Yeah, one comment is in our case, like I see you have a neuroscience and human related research in entomology. If you go to the paper, 99% you don't find the data, you just find the publication missing the actual data, and that's why I was talking about publishing the data after you publish your research and then publish the data.
I think one way to do this is you will want to have inside your paper the link to where your data is, right? So one way that I've seen people do this is they write the drafts of the paper, they submit the paper for review with a little, in parentheses, link will be inserted here. Mm-hmm. And then once the paper is accepted, you create the Figshare, or wherever Figshare is one website that allows you to share the data. You create that URL. You want that URL to be permanent. That's really important. You don't want that to be on your research group's lab homepage or something like that. You want that to be in the paper so that 10 years from now, when somebody goes and looks for that data set because they read it in the paper, they'll be able to find it. But the best case is that the paper itself already includes the link to where you might find the data. That way, the linkage is automatic between the finding and this is again sort of it's another kind of provenance, but it's allows the entire chain of custody of evidence about what you're saying in the paper to be fuller, right? If you publish after the fact, you publish some data set somewhere, and you say, oh, this is the data set that we used in this paper, it's not as strong as putting it in the paper. Just because now people have to start searching for it. They read the paper, they're like, oh, is the data available? Let me go and see. No, the paper itself already says the data is available, here it is. It's much stronger, in my opinion. And it's very doable. I think the saying we will make the data available contingent upon the paper being accepted is perfectly reasonable. I mean, sometimes as a reviewer, I want to actually look at the data. Right? If somebody makes a claim in a paper, I might want to see their data, at which point they'll have to make the data available, or how can I otherwise review their claims, right?
Yeah, I've found that since making code and data available at the time of submission, the review process goes a little easier because people are like, okay, well, I don't have to just trust her on this. I can look. Yeah, and or also clearly she is confident in this. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, for the time being, in fields in which it's not common, it's a way of advertising your competence.
Yeah, exactly.
It demonstrates your competence in a way that inspires more confidence in paper reviewers.
Yeah.
I think this will start flipping around in the future. hopefully in the near future, it will not having that will advertise your lack of competence.
Yeah.
We're all gonna have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, open science is really not that common in entomology right now. Not really. It's purely, papers, and our society's journals are closed access. And so it's really just sort of in its very fledgling stages in our field. So
Yeah.
we're the beginning of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
large stages, as Andrew says.
By the way, as an interesting point of interest, the fact that your society journals are not open access is not a God-given. It's a social. You can make a social decision to change that within your society. There's a really prominent example of, I think it's in linguistics actually, of an entire editorial board of one of their main journals decamping and saying, okay, we're not going to work with this publisher anymore, and we're all just going to start a new journal over here. They basically took the entire editorial board of a journal, started a new open access journal that is the same journal because is the journal the publisher? No, the journal is not the publisher. The journal is the content.
Right.
If you decamp the content somewhere else under conditions that are more favorable, in some respect, for example, that it's more accessible to a wider variety of people, then you can do that. So yeah, once you all move into positions of influence in your field, you can change it.
I think in my field, chemical engineering is way worse. Like because not every chemical engineer or biochemical engineer work with metadata, and from most of the paper I cited and read, I barely see any author putting their raw like data in Excel or whatever format. Most of the time, even in the supplemental data, they will put in more tables or more figures, but they are already processed, and I barely see people posting their raw data.
So one sort of last thing, we sort of touched on this, and I think you've heard about this before, so I'll just mention one thing is about open access to publication. And one of the barriers to open access to publication is the model in which we live, in which publishers somewhat live. It's a mixed world right now, where publishers close access to our papers and require subscription to their journals in order for people to be able to read our papers. One just kind of a tip to think about is to use as a way to deal with that is to use preprint servers. So that it establishes precedence. So have you heard about preprint servers before? Preprint servers are,
since they're not common in entomology, we haven't talked about them much.
so they're websites that allow people to deposit manuscripts at sort of a preprint stage. So this is often done in fields in physics. It's very, very common for people to submit to a journal and at the same time take the manuscript and put it up on a preprint server. And this establishes, for the researchers, it establishes the precedence. They can now, announce that they've made a finding and point to this preprint and say, we are the people who made this finding first. Notice the date, the timestamp on this PDF over here. And it also allows a variety of readers to access that. So it's sort of an alternate, sort of a parallel route to publish your results. Once it becomes published in a journal, you can say, okay, now I'm putting up the final version on this preprint server that is also the one that was the version that was published in the journal.
So how does that work with once you're published in a journal? Doesn't the journal own the paper? But I guess they don't own the preprint.
Well, I would push back on that. Whenever you get a journal to ask you to sign over your copyright, I would say something like, hey, how about we share the copyright? Or things of that sort. I want to retain some copyright. They might go along with that. I've seen that happen. So don't give up copyright on your work that easily.
Yeah, it's like giving the profit to the publisher all the time. We had a discussion last class, like
Yeah.
when we had with Mozilla.
Yeah, Caitlin.
Mozilla Science or Mozilla Lab.
Yeah.
And
Arguably they don't own the ideas that are in the paper. They own the typesetting and the glossy cover. So don't put the glossy cover and the typesetting in your preprint.
Yeah.
Put the the content that you own. And so I'd just like to say it's a way to deal with sort of the closed access thing. And there are actually preprint servers increasingly available for many different fields. These things are really shifting nowadays, how things are working. And so things will change over the next few years about how science is consumed. For the time being, it seems perfectly reasonable to go to, for your field, for example, bioarchive is probably a good place to put your papers. You can put preprints also on a place like Figshare. So consider doing that.
Yeah, and this is a way of also getting around certain journals have really long review processes, and sometimes you have subsequent work that cites the previous work. If this is still in review and you want to put another paper, this gives you an option of citing your previous paper.
Yeah, you can cite stuff that is on preprints. It has a DOI, a digital object identifier, which makes it a citable object. Yeah, and many journals, I should mention, many journals actually are not opposed to this system, or they will accept papers that are deposited in a preprint server. So it's not entirely, we don't have to entirely work against the journals. Some of them accept this completely, and in fields where they don't, I think they will increasingly do so, just because this works very well in physics. The physicists have made this work very well for many years now. They've been doing it for many years now, and it works great in physics. So we should just, in any other field, we should just adopt that same way of working. It's very good. So that was my own comment on open access to publication. But here are the 3 points that I made. I talked about automation, about availability of data in code. We talked a tiny little bit about open access to publication. I'll put my title here went off I'll put my contact details here just to say that you can stay in touch, and we can continue this conversation on this material if you have more things you'd like to talk about.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Ariel. Is there any more questions?
I had a bunch of questions written down. They have more to do with the actual practice of using experiments, not making your experiments reproducible.
Could you repeat that? You cut off in the middle there.
It might be off topic, actually. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think it's fair to ask. Yeah, what about incentives to actually reproduce research? Science is built on the principle that it should be reproducible, but what about?
Yeah.
I think that's where Andrew's going with this.
Yeah, that's something I was looking for the class when I knew the topic was reproducible research. Do you work in that realm at all?
So the question is, what incentive do I have to reproduce somebody else's work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe in general, in science in general, are we trying to incentivize people to reproduce experiments? It seems really important, but maybe not something that folks would be motivated to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think many fields of science are built on incremental progress.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to build upon the findings of others. And we want, so often in my work as a psychologist, for example, often I would read a paper and think, oh, this is cool, but what if we did a little tweak on what they did, on the experiment they did? And so the first step often in that process is to go and reproduce what they found, to see that it's indeed a robust finding, that we can, in our conditions, reproduce it. Often there are a lot of sort of details that are missing from the description. If we do the experiment, can we find the same thing? And then now can we tweak it a little bit to find something new about this thing? Often you want to know that you're doing things right before you go ahead and do something new. And so reproducing somebody else's work is a way to convince yourself that you're doing things right. In the computational sense, if you're writing new code to do some analysis, you might want to verify that your code works on some benchmark. Right? Somebody has published a benchmark of, here is the the result that we found on this thing. You might want to check and see that your code also derives that benchmark before you go ahead and build something more complicated on top of that. So in my mind, for me, it's like a way to increase my confidence in the work that I'm doing.
So it's
sort of incentives.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so there are incentives already in most fields anyway. The bigger hurdle is just making it easier to do.
Yeah, and ingraining it in the way that we work. I think a lot of work, our own work, is wasted on reinventing wheels that have already been invented. Right now, if I want to reproduce, if I read a paper and I say, oh, I'd like to do this experiment with a slight tweak, often there's a large amount of work that I would need to do in order to recreate the conditions that they created in their experiment. And if they provided me with all the computational tools that they used in order to create the experiment, I would be able to just jump on to the next step. It would make the entire field move faster. And ultimately, that's what we want. We want the entire field to move faster. So we need to get over a little bit of the tragedy of the commons that exists right now, where nobody has any incentive to share their research artifacts because of a perceived competition between groups.
Yeah, I was thinking about incentives and things earlier, and I thought it would be kind of cool if you could, or maybe one idea would be some kind of stamp of like, this was reproduced by this other group that you could get for your paper, which would make it even more valuable to you and also give you the incentive to make it able to be reproduced easily by someone else.
Yeah, so that is actually done. There are some journals who will do that. They will stamp your paper with a reproducible stamp on it. It'll have sort of a flag. This is also a project that we've been working on. Part of our work here at the Science Institute, we have a Reproducibility and Open Science working group. And one of the things that we've been working on is a set of badges, digital badges that people can give to themselves, or self-assess, and then receive a badge that says, here is the level of my reproducible and open science work. This again underscores the fact that it's a matter of degree. So there are many small things that you can do to make your work more reproducible.
I didn't know that existed.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still work in progress, but we're sort of thinking about how to make that gain traction.
Well, it looks like a couple of students have to hit the road, but so we should probably wrap up. So thank you so much, Ariel. This has been a great chat.
Yeah, my
so
pleasure.
glad.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Weekend.
You too. Bye.